Hello and welcome to the turning things on and off tutorial. In this video, we're going to be learning how to turn things on and off. And there's a lot of ways to do that. You could do that with activating things or enabling things. There's a few different keywords that we'll search here in our actions browser to help us find which action will be most appropriate for whatever it is that we're trying to do. The first way you could turn something on and off is by simply activating and deactivating it. If I come over here to my prefabs and drop in this cube, bring it up here, and with it selected, you can come over here to the inspector, and this little checkbox right at the top will activate and deactivate it. With the checkbox selected, that means it's activated. When you uncheck it, it's deactivated. That means that none of these components are actually running right now. This mesh renderer isn't rendering the mesh. This box collider has no collisions. It doesn't interact with anything, and this rigid body, of course, also isn't interacting because it needs this box collider to be doing something. Okay, so none of these components are doing anything when this box is deselected, but when you select it again, it's activated, and now you can see it rendering in the world, and its collider and everything should be doing its thing. So knowing that deactivating and activating something is a way of turning things on and off, let's see how we can do that with Playmaker. So I'm going to create a new empty. I'm going to call this activate and deactivate, and I'll add a new FSM. Now I could find the activate GameObject action and specify the GameObject as our cube. This is one way to set up an activate GameObject action. Alternatively, if I get rid of this, I could just drag and drop our cube into the state panel, and it gives me this little drop-down menu. I could select GameObject, activate GameObject. So it gives me that action, and it's already pre-set up with my cube. This is a slightly quicker way to work instead of just having to set up those values yourself. So with that set up, we can see that activate by default is checked, so that means that it will be activated. This checkbox is the same thing as checking and unchecking this checkbox. So with it checked, it'll be activated. So let's just see what happens when we run this right now. Okay, our cube is there, it does its thing. It's just activated. This action really didn't do much because the GameObject was already activated. If I stop this and I deselect this and I hit play, the object deactivates itself once the game starts running. So I'm going to stop this. Now I can duplicate this cube right now, and I'm just going to unpack this prefab so we can mess with it a little bit more in the scene. I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to give it this duplicate as a child of itself. Okay, so we'll make this one smaller. This is the child, right? This is nested within our main cube here. So with this activate and deactivate happening, we're going to be deactivating it, and this recursive value, we're saying yes, we do want to be recursive. That means that all the game objects underneath it will also get deactivated. So we'll see this cube get deactivated and the cube underneath get deactivated. So I'm going to hit play, and they both get deactivated. Now if I deselect this and hit play, it looks like it does the same thing. But the difference here being is that if we, let's say, just add a finish transition here and send off to another state, and if I copy this activate GameObject action, paste it in the second state, and say activate, and I don't have recursive selected. So if you're turning things on and recursive is not selected, I'm also going to give this a wait action so we could see it, what it looks like in the first state for, let's say, 3 seconds, and then we could see how it changes when it comes over to the second state. Okay, so I'm going to hit play. All right, it deactivates both, and then it reactivates both. If I change this to recursive, and now I hit play, see that deactivates both, but now it only reactivates the one we focused on. So our child game object was not reactivated because this recursive checkbox was not selected. But if you deselect this recursive checkbox, if you're saying you're just deactivating the parent object and then reactivating the parent object, you're doing no recursive programming here, and then you hit play, it turns them off, and then it turns them both back on. Okay, now the other interesting thing here is that if I get rid of this action, right? So this second state has nothing in it, and this first one, we'll say that it gets deactivated, and then it has this reset on exit option. If I select this, the moment we transfer to another state, the activate value will be flipped. So if it was activated, on exit it'll be deactivated, but But if it was deactivated, then on exit, it'll be activated. Okay, we could see that in action by just hitting play. Okay, so by default, it'll deactivate it, right? They turn off, we wait 3 seconds, and then they go back to being activated. And similarly, if you say starting as activated, they stay on for the 3 seconds and then deactivate when it goes to the next state. So reset on exit is a way of deciding how things work once the FSM transitions off to the next state. An example of using an activate GameObject action can be found in our zombie horde tutorial. We use it here in the zombie prefab at the very beginning when the zombie is created. So what happens is we have a get random child action, which gets a random child of these zombie models. So each one of these game objects here is a different type of zombie object. You'll see that if I activate this one, it is a firefighter. And if I turn it off, it goes away. If I turn on this zombie clown one, we have a clown. So this is our way of randomly selecting the type of zombie it is. And we get one of those random childs, and then we activate it using an activate game object. So even though there's nothing here, it's just a bunch of collider boxes, when you run the game, you could see that all of our zombies have randomly selected a mesh and then activate it. Like here, this one has activated their tourist mesh. Okay, so we have the activate game object action. That's all good, but let's check out, if you search activate in the action browser, you'll see that we have these other actions. You have activate game object, you have activate solo, and deactivate self. So with the cube selected, I'm gonna add an FSM to it, and I'll give it a deactivate self action. The only options we have here are delay and real time. So if I say 3 seconds and then hit play, the cube waits 3 seconds before deactivating itself. This real time option lets you ignore any time scaling. So if you're using scale time and you've decided that your game should be running faster or slower based off of time scale, using real time will ignore all that. And this 3 seconds will actually be 3 real world seconds as opposed to the in-game seconds. Okay, so let's check out this activate solo action. So let's read the tooltip for this activate solo. It says activates a game object and deactivates other game objects at the same level of hierarchy. Okay, so with all of these child cubes, I'm gonna add an FSM to the parent cube. And in here, I'm gonna put in our activate solo action. And this is where I can choose one of the children to stay activated while the rest get deactivated. Let's say I have number 3, drop it in here. Now when I hit play, all the children except for number 3 get deactivated. So you could do something like, let's see, random child, and we'll store that random child in a new variable called random child. And instead of specifying that hard-coded, we can actually select that variable we just have and put in a wait action, wait like 3 seconds before finishing and then sending back to itself. Okay, so what we should see here is random child objects getting soloed. So if I make this a little bigger and press play, okay, gets that one first and that one. Another 3 seconds passes and it selected the same one. Another 3 seconds, now it's that one, and that'll just keep going infinitely. So you could even see up here in the hierarchy, the child that's being active is the actual lighter shade of text, while the others remain the sort of grayed out, deactivated color. Okay, so that's how you activate and deactivate things. But there are other actions that still let us turn things on and off that aren't really tied to the active state of things. The other word you would search is enable. So in our actions, you have enable FSM, enable animation, GUI, fog, behavior. The most common one, I think, would end up being enable FSM. Let's check out how we could do that. In this cube, we have this FSM that gets the random child, right? So if we run it, we should expect it to do that thing we just saw where it turns a random child on and the rest of them off. Let's call this one random child. So that's our random child FSM. Now I'm gonna deactivate it or disable it by unchecking this box. When we hit play, you'll see the FSM doesn't run. It doesn't do anything. But if I select this box, it starts running, it does its thing. And you could even do this in the middle of the gameplay. So if I deselect it again, nothing's happening anymore. It just has that one soloed game object. Okay, so we could do that programmatically by adding in a new FSM, and we'll call this enable and disable random child. So if we hop in here, we could put in this enable FSM action, and you could use this little ... to select your random child FSM. And just like the activate GameObject actions, we have an enable and reset on exit. So instead of activate, it's the word enable, which essentially does the same thing, except now we're focusing on components instead of whole game objects. Components get enabled. That's all these things here. All of these things in your inspector are called components. Your transform component, your cube mesh component, mesh renderer component, rigid body component, and playmaker FSM components. For those, we say they are enabled and disabled. For game objects, these, in your hierarchy, these are activated or deactivated. That's why there's this sort of separate box for all this stuff up here. These are game object options. So with this cube, I have this enable FSM action, and by default, it'll say that it's enabling the random child FSM, so that little system should be running, but then it resets on exit, and that means it'll stop running. So let's say it runs for something like 3 seconds. So I'm gonna add in a wait action, and we'll say it runs for 3 seconds before finishing and coming over here to another state where it waits another 3 seconds, and that finishes and come back here. So over here, it's random child on, and over here, it'll be random child off. So in our random child FSM, I'm gonna change this wait to something like 0.5 seconds. So it'll be flashing between all these random children very quickly. So it'll be more apparent when our enable and disable FSM is actually doing its thing. Okay, so if we hit play, right, you get all these little flashing, and then it stops, and then it's running again. See, it's hopping between all the random children, and then it stops, and then back on. And you can even see here, the actual component, that checkbox gets checked and unchecked. And you even get a little thing here that says disabled, or it tells you which state it's currently in. Okay, so that's how you enable and disable FSMs. And remember, this reset on exit works exactly the same way. So if we deselected this, it would just stay on the whole time. See, it's still running no matter what. But if I do reset on exit, it stops. An example for using enable FSM in your games can be found in our zombie horde course here in the checkpoint game object. So in the game, we have these checkpoints that when the player reaches, it spawns a horde. In this begin countdown state, this is once the player has entered the trigger zone, there is an enable FSM that triggers this timer FSM. So if I go to the timer FSM, you can see that at the very top, it has this state which starts counting down on a timer. Now by default, this timer is off. So what happens is when we reach this begin countdown state, it gets enabled. And that way the timer starts counting down and the player has to begin defending themselves from the horde. And the thing is, you can actually enable and disable any of those components or change any of those values that are in components by using the set property action. So for example, our cube here, I'm just gonna go ahead and get rid of these FSMs. Now we just have some game objects in the scene. And let's say I want to turn off only the mesh renderer of this cube. Okay, so let's say I have all these child cubes here and I put them up like this. Okay, so with all of our yellow cubes on top of the red cube like that, if you press play, they all fall and land on it. Now I'm gonna take these cubes out of this so they're not children of that main cube anymore. And that way I can play this, and with the cube selected, I can deactivate it, and then all the cubes continue to fall, right? They're sitting on top of it, but if it doesn't exist anymore, then they all just drop to the ground. Now, if I reactivate it, it'll pop into existence where it was before, and it pushes all those cubes to the side. But what if I wanted these cubes to still react to it, but I didn't want to see the actual mesh anymore? In that case, I can deselect this mesh renderer. Now you could kind of see here, the outline of the collider is still in this space. It's still enabled. our mesh renderer is the only thing that's disabled. So if I hit play, all the cubes still land on top of the red cube, except we just can't see the red cube anymore. And I can enable and disable this mesh renderer. So the way you could do that in Playmaker is select our red cube, and let's actually turn on this mesh renderer by default. Right click, add this FSM, and what I'm gonna do is drag and drop this mesh renderer component into the state tab. And I'll get this set property. It gives me a set property action. Alternatively, you could search set property, which is down here. It's in the Unity objects category. Now with this set property action, I can select all of these values, which are all values that you can find in the mesh renderer component itself. So you see we have all these lighting and probes and materials and all these additional settings here. If I select this property menu, it gives me all those things as well. They're named a little differently because the names that show up in this list are what you type in the Unity API. And that's just a little different from what it actually shows up here on the interface. So for example, there's nothing that says enabled here, but we know that checking and unchecking this box is called enabling and disabling it. So in this property, we have this value enabled. And then it gives us a set value, which is this checkbox. By default, it gives you an empty checkbox, which means that when I press play, it disables the mesh renderer. Now, if I have this selected as every frame, we'll be able to check and uncheck this box during runtime. And you can see that it's disabled, and when I check it, it gets enabled. So this set value is what allows you to enable and disable things, and that goes for all sorts of other components. I can also drag and drop this box collider in, set property. The property will be enabled. I'll set it running every frame, and I'll also set the value to enabled. We don't want it to be off, or else it'll just fall through the floor. If I hit play, all of our cubes land on it, but then the second I uncheck this set value, it drops to the floor, and all of our cubes on top of it fall too. An example of using set property to turn something on or off can be found in our zombie horde course. In the zombie prefab, we have a health FSM, and in that health FSM, there's a dead state. This is where we play an animation of the zombie dying, and the zombie should stop moving and stop being interactable with the player. So one of the things that needs to happen there is we need to turn off the nav mesh component on the zombie. So you'll see up here we have this nav mesh agent component. So to disable it, it was dragged and dropped in here, and for the set property action, we have the value of enabled set to false. So when the zombie's dead, the nav mesh agent component gets deactivated. What's great about these set property and enable and disable and activate GameObject, all these actions, you'll see that if I'll leave in a set property here, I'll throw in a activate GameObject, and I'll throw in an enable FSM. So all these actions that we just took a look at, the part that says whether or not something is activated or enabled or otherwise on or off could always be set as a bool value. So for this set value, you could select a new variable, and this is a bool value, it would be called on or off. And same thing with this activate, you could select that on or off. And same thing with this enabled, on or off. So these bool values allow you to dynamically set whether or not a thing is on or off. Last thing I'll show you is how to make a pause menu, because a pause menu is one of those common ways that you're gonna have to activate and deactivate something. Come here to our hierarchy, and under UI, we'll add in a panel. We'll call this our pause panel. And then under our pause panel, I'll create a button, and this will be called our pause button. Okay, and with this text, we'll say that it says continue, right? Or unpause, okay? And by default, the pause panel will be deactivated. Right? You can see that when I check and uncheck this box, the panel kind of grays out the screen and the button pops up. You'll see? When I deselect it, we can see clearly again and the button isn't there. We want that off by default. You don't want to start your game up and the pause menu is already there. So I'm going to come over here to our canvas, and I'll add an FSM, and I'll say that we'll have a key down. We'll say the key is, let's say, escape. Okay, because that's usually a pause button. And then it'll send the event next. Add that transition and fire off to the next state. And we'll call this first one unpaused, and the second state paused. Now here in our pause state, we could just drag and drop our pause panel in here, GameObject, activate GameObject. And so it'll activate our pause panel. We don't want it to be recursive. We'll just let it turn everything on, and we'll have it reset on exit. So when we leave this state, it turns off. Now, how do we make it leave this state? We could turn on this pause panel to see what we have here. We have this continue button. Now with our pause button selected, I'll right click and add an FSM, and then we'll add a state. We'll call this one clicked, and we'll give it a global transition, a UI event called UI click. This will allow us to click this button and have this global transition send off to this state, which is where we could put in a send event action. And we'll be focusing on the GameObject FSM of our canvas, the FSM on it. We could even call this something like our pause menu. So over here in our pause button, you could select that pause menu, and we'll create a new event called send back. Okay, and that's going to be a global transition. And hit OK, and we could send that global event send back. Now here in our canvas, we could add our transition custom events send back. Have this transition send back here, and when it does that, this reset on exit will take care of deactivating this panel for us. Okay, so I'm going to deactivate this by default, right? You don't want to start your game with the pause menu on screen. And I'm going to hit play. Okay, and then I can hit escape, brings up our pause panel, and then I can hit continue, and it turns it off. Right, so that's how you deactivate and activate something. And by the way, because it's actually a pause menu and not just some user interface, just a window popping up, if you really did want to pause, you could have your scale time in here set to 0, and then copy and paste this action back in the unpaused and set it to 1. So scale time at 1 is like normal speed, and scale time at 0 is saying that no time is passing at all. So when you're in paused, you're saying nothing moves, and in unpaused, you're saying everything moves. Now you can use all these activate and enable actions, and don't forget set property, to turn things on and off in your game. Be sure to check out our other videos to learn all the various features of Playmaker. Links to more learning resources are in the description.